welcome everybody. Y'all come right in. I want to share a couple of things. We're going to be in John chapter 7, just so you can find your place this morning in John chapter 7. I want to share a couple of things with y'all before we actually get into John 7. First of all, I want to encourage y'all. Some of you have already done this, and we would be glad for others to if you'd like. We have our retreat scheduled for February the 17th, and we would love for you to think about being a part of that adult retreat. There's still there's a few rooms that are left, and so if you'd like to get online to sandridgebaptist.com, you can register there. We're going to have a great retreat. Dr. Alan Simpson's a very good friend of mine. I've known him since my freshman year of college, and we went to seminary together. We worked together in seminary. I was at his wedding. He was at ours. So we've known each other a long time. And Alan is going to be with us and leading us. We've been talking about the weekend, and it's going to be, I think, a wonderful spiritual time of spiritual growth. So if you're interested in going to Linden Valley, and you may say, well, I was at Camp Linden 100 years ago. Let me tell you, it's a lot different than it was 100 years ago. We've spent multi-millions of dollars building conference centers. And we have hotel rooms. They've newly renovated, new beds, new everything. It's just like going to a good hotel. And so if you'd like to be part of that, we would love for you to be part of that retreat. So that's number one. Second thing I want to tell you is that I sent out this week an email, just a shot in the dark kind of boom email. And we have a number of people who are interested in going to Israel. We've had a number of people wanting to go to Israel. And I hadn't really done my homework as much as I should have and seen how many are interested. But I think I got about between 10 and 15 responses just pretty immediately, you know. And so if you are interested in going to Israel with us, we're going to have an informational meeting. I'll shoot you a text through the church text system and the email. If you don't get our communication from the text system or from the emails, please let us know so we can help you to keep up. But if you are interested in going to Israel, I would encourage you to go ahead and get your passport, and we'll talk more about it. I'll answer any questions you have about that. And I've got a number of people who've been who want to go back. They enjoyed it so much. They just want to experience in even more depth than they did. So I think you never learn everything about the land where Jesus walked and all of that. So anyway, if you're interested, I'd love to hear from you and let me know more about that. Let me also remind y'all, and I'm going to do this again in church so y'all can get a second helping of it. February the 12th is our joint service with the Mount Calvary Baptist Church. Now, how many of y'all have ever been to the Mount Calvary service before? Anybody? A handful of you? All right, look, if you don't want to come hear me preach, I get that. I don't want to hear me preach half the time. You don't want to miss the meal. You don't want to miss the meal. They do a good job feeding us. Fellowship is fantastic. We enjoy each other's company. We've developed relationships over the years. I think it's a very positive thing in the life of our church. And so February the 12th, we're going to be at Mount Calvary. And you say, well, when? Well, we get out of church here, 11:30 or whatever. Mount Calvary is going to have lunch ready for us just about the time you'd get there, 12:30 in that range. And it'll take a while for everybody to eat and get through the line. And we'll start the service somewhere around 2 o'clock and be done by 3 o'clock. So you can come home and watch the Super Bowl, okay? We're not going to let you be away from the Super Bowl. But that is Super Bowl Sunday. And so I would encourage you to go, and you may say, well, I went one time and I didn't find a place to park. Well, what we're going to do is if you want to park at the high school, we'll run our bus as a shuttle back and forth from the high school. And so if you think you'll have trouble parking, just park at the high school. We'll drop you off the front door. And so that'll be on February the 12th. So I wanted everybody to be aware of that date. So, man, there's a lot going on. I have had a very busy few days. Yes, go ahead. Mount Calvary it's the old Cumberland Presbyterian Church at 60 Brown Street. Y'all remember the old Cumberland? They bought that years ago. They've been in that building now for 20 plus years. And that street has limited parking. So we'll park over at the high school. But yeah, I mean, if you get there in time, you can park. But if you need to park at the high school, and we'll shuttle everybody over. Wonderful fellowship. Lonnie Black was their pastor for many years. Lonnie and I are still friends. He was here, by the way, a few weeks ago when I had COVID. They were to be here that Sunday. I had COVID and I forgot about it, and here they come. But Lonnie's a good friend, and now Schaefer Williams is their pastor. But we'll be leading the worship in the church that day. They'll be providing the meal. That's the way we kind of do things. So hope y'all will come. Anybody else have a question? I didn't mean to get ahead of anybody. Okay. All right. As I was telling you, let's go to John chapter 7. But as I was telling you, I had a busy couple of days. My daughter, who lives on the Gulf Coast, teaches English, and she's in a theater group or whatever you would call it. And they are doing a production of Steel Magnolias. Anybody familiar with Steel Magnolias? Y'all remember that? Okay. All right. A lot of religious references in Steel Magnolias. But if you're familiar with Steel Magnolias, our daughter was playing the part of Annelle, who was the real naive and country girl. And Rebecca put on the thickest accent. I mean, she sounded like she was from West Tennessee. Hi, y'all. I mean, it was vowels being stretched for days, and they did an awesome job with this. Well, we went down on Friday, drove down, got there in time to eat a bite, go straight to the theater, see the play, went to bed. Well, got up the next morning and drove back. So about 850, 900 miles in 2 days to see the play. So that's what you do for your children, and I was glad to do it. So anyway, very, very happy to do that. All right, anything else anybody wants to share before we get into John chapter 7? All right. I appreciate y'all participating as Dr. Norman taught last week. I know that I enjoyed the weekend. I know it was more in depth than sometimes we get, and that may be a shame actually, but appreciate everybody participating in that, and hope y'all learned some things. Y'all turn to John 7. There was a lady, an elderly lady, who went shopping, came out of the shopping center, had her bags, goes up to her car, and there are 4 men sitting in her car. Well, they picked the wrong car, because this older lady was packing. And she dropped her bags and whipped out her gun, and she pointed it in that car and said, "You get out of this car or I'm going to start shooting. Get out." And those 4 guys hit the doors and they skedaddled. Well, she watched them run, picked up her bags and put them in the car, got her keys out, put it in the ignition, and they wouldn't fit. And she got out and she thought, wait a minute. And she looked, and her car was about 2 cars down in the parking lot. So she puts her bags into her car, starts her car up, drives to the police station, and goes up to the desk to the lieutenant or sergeant or whoever's at the desk and says, "I came out of the store and these 4 young men I thought were in my car, and I pulled my gun on them and I ran them off." And he starts just laughing his head off. He said, "Do they look anything like them 4 pale fellas right over there?" They had gone to the police station to put in their report. Well, they worked it out. No charges were filed. But when that lady got into her car, finally, took her a minute, put her key in the ignition, she probably didn't think, "I wish there were multiple keys that fit this ignition." And even when she was in the wrong car and her key really didn't work, she probably didn't say, "You know what, they ought to make every key fit every car. They ought to make it where all keys fit all cars." No, she knew, even in a moment like that, that there was one key for her car, and there was only one key for her car. When we began to talk about our relationship with God through faith in Jesus Christ, There are people who get very angry that every key doesn't fit every car. They want to say, well, you know, you ought to be able to come to God through this religion, blah, 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 you know, that kind of stuff. And God ought to be gracious and make all these ways. Well, let me remind you, God is gracious in that He made a way. He didn't have to do that. None of us deserve to have a relationship with God and to live with Him eternally. Does anybody deserve that in this room? Well, we don't deserve that. God has chosen to make a way for us to go to our Heavenly Father and to walk with Him and to love Him and to be in a relationship with Him. And that way is given to us in the 14th chapter of John when Jesus says, I am the what? Way. Not a way, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And we need to never forget that every person who has a relationship with God has that relationship with God because of the same thing. You have a relationship with God, if you have one today, because of Jesus Christ, who is Savior. He is the only way anybody has ever gotten to the Father. In fact, if you read Galatians chapter 3, Galatians chapter 3 tells us that even old Abraham, Father Abraham, who had many sons had Father Abraham, and I am one of them, and so are you. And even old Father Abraham came to God because of Jesus. You say, well, he didn't even know the name of Jesus. No, he didn't. But Galatians chapter 3 says that the gospel was preached beforehand to Abraham. And the truth is that the gospel is salvation by grace through faith, and Abraham believed God, and it was credited unto him as righteousness, and he believed in the Messiah who was to come. We believe in the Messiah who has come. But everybody is saved if they are saved, Old Testament, New Testament, whatever, because of the work of Christ, who is, by the way, the Lamb slain before the foundation of the world. He is the eternal God, and you learned that last week. If you were here for our F2 conference, you learned that Jesus is the Son of God. He's also God the Son, and He's eternal, and that He has always existed. He didn't just come into existence at Bethlehem. And so everybody who is saved because of their because of their faith in the Lord Jesus. Turn to John chapter 7, and I want to show you this morning some things about Christ as we look at your lesson. And you're going to see how Jesus, of course, was sent by the Father today. One of the things you're going to learn today is how Jesus is such a wonderful and an amazing teacher, and how God teaches us through the life of our Savior. And so there's a lot that we're going to hopefully pick up on today. Y'all turn to John chapter 7. John chapter 7. Let's begin in verse 1. After these things, Jesus walked in Galilee, for He did not want to walk in Judea because the Jews sought to kill Him. Now the feast of the tabernacles was at hand, and His brothers therefore said to Him, Depart from here and go into Judea, that your disciples may also see the works that you are doing. For no one does anything in secret while he himself seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world. For even His brothers did not believe in Him. Then Jesus said to him, My time has not yet come, but your time is always ready. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify of it that its works are evil. You go up to this feast. I am not yet going up to this feast, for my time has not yet fully come. And when He said these things to them, He remained in Galilee. Verse 10. But when His brothers had gone up, He also went up to the feast, not openly, but in secret. Then the Jews sought Him at the feast, saying, Where is He? And there was much complaining among the people concerning Him. And some said, He is good, and others said, No, He's contrary, He deceives the people. However, no one spoke openly of Him for fear of the Jews. Now about the middle of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and taught. Stop at the end of verse 14. The last word of verse 14 is the word what? Taught. Now I want to ask you, if y'all can remember back in your younger days, who your favorite teacher was. Does anybody remember your favorite teacher from school? Did any of y'all go to school? Did y'all attend? All right. Who was your favorite teacher, somebody? Do you remember their name? Your father was your favorite teacher? Was he a school teacher? High school algebra. Your dad was. So you inherited that, right? And then you married that. All right. So there's a lot of education in that line. Who else? Somebody, who was your favorite teacher? Does anybody remember your favorite teacher? Yes, Dot. And why was she your favorite teacher? Or he, I'm sorry. Okay. Okay. Wow. He taught 1st through 8th grade? Really? Where'd you go to school? A one-room schoolhouse? Really? Yeah, I've heard of that. I have heard of that. I've watched Little House on the Prairie. So, yes, I've heard of that. Now, did you go to a one-room schoolhouse too? Really? Did Reverend Alden come over and, take the kids over to Bible study? No, Reverend Alden, that was from Little House on the Prairie. Yeah. Did y'all know that, how many of y'all parked across Sandridge Road this morning? Did anybody park across the road over there? Did y'all know y'all parked on the property of the old Sandridge School? Did you know that? We bought that property several years ago, and the house was not in good repair, and it was taken down. But that's the Sandridge School, for those of you who didn't know that. There used to be a lot of those around here. My Aunt Hattie used to teach in the one-room school in our community. She taught my grandfather. And the story I always heard was how she would wear him out all the time and give him discipline because he was probably like his grandson and probably deserved it. No, she would actually make him go to the board to ride, do something. And he would always say, you can lead a mule to water, but you can't make him drink. And she didn't like that very much. And she taught him how to drink water, I think, a time or two. So yeah, one-room schoolhouses were pretty impressive. Well, I remember teachers who really made an impact on my life. You probably remember teachers who made an impact on your life. I had some great teachers when I was in seminary that made me think, who taught me things that I probably didn't even know I needed to learn. One of my favorite was Dr. Daniel Holcomb, who was the chairman of my doctoral committee, and Dr. Fisher Humphreys. There were a lot of people who really played a role in my life. There were people who asked me difficult questions when I was in school. My first day, by the way, when I entered the master's program, I'd already had my bachelor's, and the first day in my master's program, I walked into a class, probably 50, 60 students, and Dr. Joe Truell was teaching ethics, and he was, I came to learn this quickly, his procedure was to say, all right, good morning, Mr. Comer. And then he would ask some question. First day I was in seminary, Mr. Comer, can you define and describe the difference between deontological ethics and teleological ethics and give examples of each? Can any of y'all do that, by the way? All right. Well, he thought he had Mr. Comer. He didn't realize that Mr. Comer had minored in philosophy when he was in college. And so I began to tell him the difference between deontological and teleological ethics, one being a duty-based ethic, the other being a result-based ethic, and where they came from and who was behind them and how they applied. And he just stared at me. And when I finished, there was a pause. And then the crowd, the audience broke out into applause, thanking God they didn't get the question. But yeah, I appreciate those things now. I remember teachers that made a big, big difference in my life, and I'm grateful for them. One of the real people who had a big difference in my life was somebody who told me once in a discussion after I made some inane comment. He said, Marty, you need to really learn to think for yourself. I'll never forget that lesson from that man. Because every one of us need to learn how to think for yourself. You need to have your own beliefs. You need to have your own faith. You need to have your own understanding of things. And you're not going to stand before God someday and give an account of what I taught. I'll do that. And by the way, I'll face a stricter judgment according to James chapter 3 for what I've done. You will give an account of what you believe and what your level of understanding is and for what things you have promoted in your life. Well, Jesus, if he was anything, and he was many things, was a teacher. And here he goes to the feast at Jerusalem, and he's going to ultimately be teaching. And the reason that he's going to be teaching is because there was a lot of error in the world. And please hear me, there is truth and there is falsehood when it comes to ultimate things. And Jesus was the way, the what? Truth. He was the embodiment of truth. He possessed truth. He spoke truth. He revealed truth. Everything about him was truth. And when Pilate cynically said at the end, "What is truth?" Jesus could have just said, "Hey, I am truth. You are looking at truth." Well, we need as his followers to proclaim truth. It's our responsibility to do that. No, we're not perfect. We don't know everything. But what has been revealed to us, we need to proclaim. We need to share that. We need to preach that because truth matters. Truth matters. And sometimes people are like, no, just believe and just love and whatever. Well, we want to love everybody. But we've got to be people who proclaim truth. Truth is important. Now, Jesus also taught, not only because truth is important, but he taught because there were many who didn't believe. Now, go back to verse 1 and let me show you some of those people. In verse 1, it says that Jesus, after these things, walked in Galilee, and he didn't want to walk in Judea. The Jews were seeking to kill him. So there were a lot of Jews who didn't believe, right? They wanted to kill him. There were people who wanted to take his life. They were offended at him. And so there are a lot of people culturally who do not believe. Now, just let me say for a moment that there are many people in our culture who do not believe. And that should not surprise us. We sometimes get all put out about, I saw this on the news, and people said this, and people did this, and I saw it on Twitter, and I read this on Facebook, and people act, in strange ways. Let me tell you, why does that surprise you? The world is offended by truth. Darkness has no relationship with light. And so we shouldn't be surprised that we live in a world culture that's not following Jesus. They didn't follow him when he was here. Now look at verse 2. The feast of the Jews, Jews' feast of the tabernacle was at hand, and his brothers, family. Now you knew that Jesus had half brothers, right? I want to make this very, very clear. I almost got in trouble one time. Somebody said, "You don't believe in the virgin birth." I said, "Absolutely, I believe in the virgin birth, but I also believe that after Jesus was born of the Virgin Mary, that Mary and Joseph had other children, and Jesus had half, if you will, siblings." And so these are his brothers. And his brothers say, "Why don't you depart from here and go into Judea that your disciples may also see the works that you're doing? Why don't you get out of this little podunk town and go where the World's Fair is, the Feast of the Tabernacles, where there's a big crowd, and let everybody see what you're doing." Look at verse 4. "For no one does anything in secret while he himself seeks to be known openly. And if you do these things, show yourself to the world." They were saying, if you really are who you say you are, why don't you go and just prove it in the big city, man? Now, why were his brothers doing this? Look at the next verse. Did you see it? They didn't believe in him. His brothers, raised in his house. Now, let me just give them a little credit here. I mean, if my brother had come to me and said, "Oh, by the way, I'm the Messiah, I'm the Son of God," I'd say, "No, you're out of your mind," is what I would say. So how many of y'all would say that about your brother? They were familiar with him and whatever. And so they didn't believe that he was who he was claiming to be. But his brothers didn't believe. And so you have people in the culture who don't believe. You have people in his own family who don't believe. And let me just say that they didn't believe some of his family until the resurrection. Because 1 Corinthians says that after he was resurrected, 1 Corinthians 15, it says he appeared to James. He had to come and say, "Hey, James, it's me." And then you'll remember we have a book of James in our Bible. Remember the epistle that James writes, wonderful little book? That's written by the half-brother of Jesus who doesn't come to believe until after the resurrection. And then you have Jude. That's probably another half-brother, and that one too didn't believe until after the resurrection. And so when people say, if I'd only been there, I would have followed Jesus. If I'd only been there, I'd have believed. No, you wouldn't. We are no better than any of those other people. Who's to say that we would have? Well, his brothers didn't believe. But notice in verse 6, they say, my time has not, or he says to them, my time has not yet come. Jesus was always conscious of the right time and the Father's time and the perfect time to reveal himself. My time has not yet come. And then he says to his brothers, your time is always ready. Y'all always do things, haste and, hurry, and you're always thinking about, just doing things your way. But he says, my time hasn't not come. I want you to capture this. Jesus did not just show up when he did, where he did, and at the time he did, just because. Jesus showed up in Bethlehem in 45 BC at that moment because it was the Father's perfect timing. He lived in Nazareth because that was the Father's perfect will. He revealed himself as Messiah and died in Jerusalem at a very precise moment, at a perfect time, what we would call a kairos moment, a pregnant moment. That's a word in Greek that talks about a moment that is filled with opportunity. And you say, well, what was so perfect about it? Well, the reason he was born in Bethlehem is because there was an order that went out for you to go back to your town of origin in order for there to be a census and a tax that to be done. And for him to be born in Bethlehem, they had to leave Nazareth and go to Bethlehem, right? So there had to be a reason for them to go. You didn't just go because you want to go to Walmart. There had to be a reason for them to travel. And so Mary is pregnant and they're riding. She may be riding on a donkey. There's some walking involved. It's probably 90 miles down there. No roads, not good roads. And so they went there because the prophet had said, but you, Bethlehem Ephratah, out of you will come the Messiah. Micah chapter 5, verse 2. Perfect time. Not only that, he was born in a time when Rome ruled the world. And Rome was the big empire. And they had built roads so that, you could travel, you could share the gospel, you could move about, not only with trade, but news could go from one place to the other. And so you have the ability to spread the word. There was also peace, because it's really hard to spread the word if war is going on. And Rome had what was called the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. They rule the world, and so there's peace and travel and communication. And Jesus came at the perfect time, socially and politically and culturally and all these things. He was always right on time. That ought to remind us that in our life, we sometimes think, God, when are you going to intervene? God, when are you going to show yourself to me? God, when are you going to answer that prayer that I've prayed 100 times? Let me tell you, God is never late. He is always on time. Even when, for example, in John, in chapter 4, when chapter 11, when Lazarus, his friend, dies, and the sisters are going, if you'd only been here, he wouldn't have died. And Jesus cries because they're crying. He's a kind, compassionate fellow. But he knew he was going to raise him from the grave and demonstrate the glory of God and show that he is the resurrection and the life. He knew that death would not end in sadness, but it would end in glory. He was always right on time. Have you ever wondered if God was going to show up for you? Have you? I've wondered sometimes if God is going to show up and meet the need that I have. Let me tell you, he's always right on time. Always. Now look at verse 7. He says the world can't hate you, but it hates me. Darkness doesn't hate darkness. World doesn't hate world. World hates light. World hates truth. And so when we get up and we begin to say, here's the truth of God, they'll look at us and think, well, we're the problem. But they're not hating each other out there. I mean, the world gets along fine with the world as long as everybody just lets everything go, right? But as soon as you begin to say, okay, here's a line in the sand, and we're over here, and you're over there, and we love you, and we want you to come over here because this is the kingdom of light, they're going to say, no, I don't like you very much. I don't know where we in the church ever got this idea that we were the home team and that we had somehow, more rights to everything being our way. But, when I was growing up, we were the home team. Everybody went to church. People respected the church. Even if they didn't go to church, they respected the church. I can remember the days of, you talked about one-room schools. Y'all remember blue laws? Y'all remember when everything was closed on Sunday and you couldn't go to the store and you couldn't have, nobody went out to eat on Sunday because there wasn't anything open. There was nowhere to eat. I mean, we had Johnny's Drive-In and Duty's Diner. Man, neither one of them were open on Sunday when I was a kid. That was all we had. But my point is, we thought we were the home team. We got to dictate the terms of how things went. Listen, that's not ever happening. I mean, that doesn't happen to the church. We are the visiting team. Our citizenship is in where? Heaven. We are citizens of heaven. We are ambassadors here. We are pilgrims here. We're passing through here. And so what we need to do is to realize as we are ambassadors and we're passing through, our job is to take as many people with us as we can. But we're to tell them about what's going on in our home country. We're to tell them about Christ. Well, I didn't mean to get off on that. Look at verse 8. He says, you go up to the feast. I'm not going up yet. My time hasn't fully come. And so when he said these things, he remained in Galilee. And so Jesus says, I'm going to stay back in Galilee. And the brothers, verse 10, they go up to the feast. And then after they go up to the feast, he goes up, but he goes secretly. And he goes secretly because he does not want to precipitate a triumphal entry before its time. Ultimately, you'll remember he does go to Jerusalem and they have this triumphal entry where he rides in on a donkey and he rides in with people shouting hosannas and trying to virtually make him Messiah at that moment. And Jesus goes now secretly because he doesn't want to precipitate that before its time. And the Jews sought him. They expected him there. Verse 11, the Jews looking around, where is this guy? Where is this guy? Where is he? And verse 12 says there was much complaining among the people. And some were saying he's good, and others were saying no, on the contrary, he's a deceiver. There were some who were entrenched in their ways, and there were others who were open to the truth, and then there were those who didn't like him at all. Verse 13, no one spoke openly of him for fear of the leadership, the Jews who ran the city of Jerusalem. Now, you got to ask yourself, what's going on in Jerusalem right now? It is the Feast of the Tabernacles. Do y'all know what the Feast of the Tabernacles is? Anybody ever celebrate that and give your preacher a gift on Feast of the Tabernacles? Nobody ever does that. Feast of the Tabernacles was a celebration, number one, of the harvest, but it was a celebration, too, of the Exodus. And what they would do is they would come to Jerusalem and they would all make these little shanties, these little booths, and these little huts. And they would live in these huts for a period of time while they were in Jerusalem having a big party, because they were celebrating when they left Egypt. They would have to live in huts or live in booths or whatever as they were leaving Egypt. And so it was a celebration that God is our deliverer. He got us out of Egypt, and God is going to continue to be our deliverer. And so the city is filled. It is a party. It's one of the most celebratory times in the city. And so Jesus comes in the middle of all of that, but nobody's talking about him, verse 13, because they're afraid of the authorities. But in the middle of the feast, look at verse 14. In the middle of this feast, Jesus goes up to the temple and he teaches, and the Jews marveled, saying, how does this man know letters, having never studied? Do y'all know where Jesus grew up? Nazareth. If you go to Nazareth with us when we go to Israel, you're going to look around at this city and say, wow, this is a big town. Nazareth, in the days of Jesus, consisted of maybe 12 families. Maybe. The big city was over the mountain. It was the city of Sepphoris. So Jesus didn't live in some big town. He lived in the backwater. He lived in the middle of nowhere. He probably spoke kind of like my daughter did in Still Magnolias Friday night, with a real thick Galilean accent. It's probably what he talked like. Because if y'all will remember, when Peter was in the courtyard denying the Lord, they said, "You're with him. You're a Galilean." How do you know? Because he talked funny. He had that accent. He spoke like somebody from Galilee. And so here's Jesus in the middle of Jerusalem teaching. They marvel at his teaching. And then they say, "But how does he know this stuff? How did he figure all this out?" I want you to notice verse 16. Jesus said, "My doctrine is" what? Not mine, but his who sent me. And if anyone wills to do his will, he shall know concerning the doctrine whether it is from God or whether I speak on my own authority. Stop. Verse 16, this is not my doctrine, my teaching. Whose is it? It's the Father's. Does that remind you of anything you learned last weekend? That Jesus was sent from the Father. He was thrust into the world by the Father. He did the Father's will. He communed with the Father. He was never in contradiction with the Father in anything that he did. When we talk about Jesus, you need to remember that he is not only the Son of God, he is God the Son. And as God the Son, he perfectly taught the Father's doctrine, if you will. What he taught was from him who sent him. It was heavenly. Verse 17, and if you want to do his will, you shall know concerning the doctrine whether it is from God or whether I speak on my own authority. Now listen, there are two ways that I can teach you this morning. I can teach you good stuff, how to plant a garden, how to get your finances in order, get your will prepared, 8 ways to please your grandchild. I could give you good stuff. And you go to a lot of churches and you get good stuff. They'll tell you, hey, here's 6 ways to buy a new car on the cheap, or here's 8 ways to have a better relationship. I mean, that's all good stuff. My choice is to give you either good stuff or to give you God's stuff. That's it. And if you leave this place today and say, well, he gave us good stuff, you might have gotten something from me. You could have gotten from an advice column in the newspaper or hints from Heloise. Y'all remember hints from Heloise years ago in the newspaper? I mean, you might get something from me you could have just downloaded. My job is not to give you good stuff. My job is to give you God's stuff, which is the best stuff. And Jesus says, the teaching that I give to you is from the Father. I don't speak of my own authority. Therefore, he says, I didn't have to have letters. I didn't have to study under this rabbi or that rabbi, because the authority is from within. Now listen, I don't know if you've ever had this experience or not, but I've been around a lot of teachers, and I've taught a lot of things. And I've been around a lot of teachers, and I would say, they've really studied a lot, and they really know, they've studied this person or this theory or that theory, and they're good at talking about this or that thing. And that's all good. We need that. But, I've been around some other teachers, and they've studied all that stuff too. But when they taught, they weren't just telling you what somebody else said. They were speaking out of an authority in their own life. They had lived it. They had internalized it. They had experienced it. And y'all, I've had some people teach me stuff that didn't have letters, didn't have degrees. I've got several degrees. If you want some, I'll give you some. I ain't using them. They're there. I love education. I believe you ought to get all the education you can, all the education you can afford. I believe in education. But I've had people who were unlearned educationally teach me some really good things. Jesus was speaking out of his own authority. And his authority was not in what he had been taught by others, but it was who he was. It was a kind of character that he had. Listen, when somebody has been with God and they have spent time with God And they know God because they stay in the Word. They speak to Him in prayer. They share Him with others. They walk with Him every day. They may not quote Greek and Hebrew words to me, but I'm telling you, those people have something to say. Be with God. That's where you gain the authority to speak His will. Now look at verse 18. He says, he who speaks from himself seeks his own glory. But he who seeks the glory of the one who sent him is true. My job, your job, a believer's job, Christ's job was to seek the glory of the one who sent Christ. No unrighteousness is in God, nor is any unrighteousness in His Son. Look at verse 19. Did not Moses give you the law? Yet none of you keeps the law. Why do you seek to kill me? Now I want you to think about this. He says, Moses gives you the law, but y'all aren't keeping it. You're out trying to kill me. What law did Moses give? Didn't he give a law that says, thou shalt not murder? And even though Moses gave the law that said, thou shalt not kill, they're out trying to kill somebody. So Jesus is looking at them and says, what good's you're learning? I mean, if you're not going to do what you're taught, what good is it? You know better than that. You know that it's wrong to kill. You know that it's wrong to take life. But I want you to notice a little further. Verse 20, the people answered, and they said, you have a demon. Translated in English, you're nuts. You're out of your head. Who's seeking to kill you? And Jesus answered, verse 21, and said, I did one work, and all of you marvel. Do you have any idea what He's talking about there? I did one work, and you're all marveling. Does anybody have any idea what He's talking about? What is the one work Jesus did? Do y'all remember back in John chapter 5, just a couple of weeks ago? We talked about Jesus coming into Jerusalem and going to the pool of Bethesda. Do y'all remember that? And when He went to the pool of Bethesda, there was a man there who had been a paralytic for 38 years. You remember that guy? And he had been trying to get down into the water when it was moved, and he couldn't, and he had no hope and whatever. And Jesus asked that guy, do you want to be made well? Remember that? And the guy's like, do I want to be well, man? I've been a paralytic for 38 years. Yeah, I'll be glad to be made well. Jesus healed him. Do y'all remember what day it was on? It was on the Sabbath day. Did that make him happy or sad that He healed on the Sabbath? Did that make everybody happy or sad that Jesus healed on the Sabbath day? All right. It made them mad, for those of you who didn't answer. They didn't like it very much. Because Jews believe that you should not ever work on the Sabbath. In fact, like I said, if y'all want to go to Israel with us, one of the coolest things in Israel, I'll try to get them to do this if you go with us. I'll try to get them to put us in a really high hotel with like 20 floors. And I'll try to get you on the 20th floor. And then I'll make sure you're there on the Sabbath day. Because they don't believe that you should be able to operate an elevator on the Sabbath day. Okay? And so they have what's called Sabbath settings. Because they believe that if you have an elevator operating on the Sabbath day and you push the little button that says 20, you have made fire. You've made a connection. You can't build fire on the Sabbath. You can't make fire on the Sabbath. And so what they do is they have Sabbath settings, which means that on Sabbath, your elevator stops at every floor all by itself. It is the most awful thing in the world. 19, 18. I mean, you're like, where's the stairs in this place? But they still do that because you don't make fire on the Sabbath. Now, that's nothing compared to the way it was in Jesus' day. I mean, if you had an earache, you better put a cotton wadding with some ointment in your ear on the day before the Sabbath. You couldn't put it in on the Sabbath. And if it fell out on the Sabbath, you couldn't put it back. That's work. And also the ointment would be applied on the Sabbath, and the ointment might bring healing. And so the ointment couldn't heal. That's work. Oh, and you also couldn't fix yourself up on the Sabbath, ladies, because you couldn't look in a mirror. Because if you looked in a mirror, you might see a gray hair. That's not a sin, by the way, to have gray hair, thank goodness. But it is a sin to pluck it out. And you might be tempted to pluck it out. And if you did that, that's work on the Sabbath. And so they believed in their legalisms more than their love. And Jesus said, here's a man that I healed on the Sabbath, and all y'all are mad about. I did one work. But I want you to notice how he gets them. It's called casuistry, and he pulls this argument together, and he applies their law to themselves. Look in verse 21. I did one work, you're all marveling. I love this, verse 22. Moses therefore gave you circumcision. Not that it is from Moses, but from the Father. It actually predates, but anyway, it goes back to Abraham. He says, and you circumcise a man on the Sabbath. Now let's stop and think for a second. Think. When did little Jewish boys get circumcised? Does anybody remember? What day was it? The 8th day. Because Paul, bragging about his Jewish heritage in Philippians 3, says, I'm a Pharisee of the Pharisees, a Hebrew of the Hebrews, tribe of Benjamin. If you're going to pledge a fraternity, you pledge Benjamin. He said, I was the tribe of Benjamin, circumcised on the 8th day. And he says, I got my credentials. 8th day. Here's the deal. What if the 8th day falls on the Sabbath? What if a little baby is born and the 8th day is the Sabbath day? Well, we got us a little problem here, don't we? Well, how do we solve this little problem? What do you do? Do you say, well, we'll circumcise him on the 7th day? No, can't do that. Circumcise on the 8th day. We'll do it on the 9th day. Oh, no, can't do that. So they said, hey, we'll make an exception. If this kid needs to be circumcised on the 8th day, we'll call time out on the laws, and we'll do the circumcision, even though that's a medical procedure and it's work, and you're not supposed to do that. We'll wing it. Now I want you to notice what Jesus says. Look, if you will, in verse 22. Moses gave you circumcision. That's not from Moses, but the fathers. And you circumcise a man on the Sabbath. You'll do it. But if a man receives circumcision on the Sabbath so that the law of Moses should not be broken, are you angry with me because I made a man completely well on the Sabbath? He says you can do your medical procedure because, we got to do that. It's 8th day. He said, but what if I heal the entire person? What if I make a man walk? What if I give him hope? What if I give him help? And they're over there saying, we love our rules more than we love people. Now let me ask you, have you ever been in a church that love rules more than people? You ever been around Christians that love rules more than people? Listen, you better be very careful, and so had I, about adding our rules to the things of God. We need to again, guard against legalism. Legalism destroys. Do y'all know what legalism is? Legalism is man-made rules applied to the things of Christ. Let me give you an example. Oh, I got to let y'all go. It's almost 10 o'clock. Let me give you an example, and then I'll let you go. My mother, I love her so much. They go to the church that I grew up in. And the church that I grew up in was a legalistic church. They believed in their rules. And one of those was that women could not go to church wearing what? Pants. Okay? And I have actually seen with my own eyes a woman come into the church when I was a boy wearing pants and be told, you can't come here. And I also know that ended up in families being destroyed and all kinds of terrible things, and people just leave, it ended up hurting tons of people. I don't want to get into all that. My mother, when I first came to Sand Ridge, they were going to come up to visit. My mother calls one day and she says, Marty, would it be okay if I wore pants to church? And I said, Mother, if you come to church tomorrow, please wear some pants. Do not come in here without pants on. You make sure that you have pants when you come to church. And she's like, I'm going to kill you. She's usually going to get me. And I said, Mother, no, of course you can wear pants. We're not the fashion police. We are not the fashion police. We're interested in people's hearts. Jesus lived in a day where people were more interested in their rules. He came to teach truth, and He came to set people free, and thank God. Now, once you come to faith in Christ, you will learn modesty, and you will learn decency, and you will learn to not offend others, and you'll learn to not try to offend the weaker brother, and all kind of things will lead you to do things right, and the Holy Spirit will give you guidance for that. But legalism will destroy. I didn't mean to keep you all so long. We got to get ready for baptism. So let me pray for you, and we're going to have baptism this morning, and y'all feel free to join us out in the commons for baptism. Father, I love you. I thank you for this lesson. So much here when we begin to study the life of Jesus, and I pray that we will let Him be our favorite teacher, and we will follow His teaching and His commands, abiding in your word, truly being your disciples, and we then know the truth, and the truth sets us free to live, free to love, free to share, free to humble ourselves before you, free to bring others the gospel so they can enter the kingdom. Thank you again for Jesus, in whose name we pray. Amen, and I don't apologize for keeping you late, but I love you.